Hello and welcome to another installment of the Wyrd Chronicles. Each episode, we bring you tales of action and adventure from Malifaux and the other side. The Resurrectionists are some of the most feared and reviled magic users in Malifaux. Every Resurrectionist has his or her own predilections. Some animate corpses or create abominations from severed body parts. Others summon ghosts and spirits to do their bidding. There are those who say that every faction in Malifaux secretly harbours Resurrectionists, and that the rot goes even to the heart of the guild. I hope you enjoy part 1 of Nemesis.
Nemesis, Part 1, by Mason Crawford. Lady Justice flicked her blade, cleaning the ichor from it as the ghoulish, three-headed beast slumped to the ground. Even without sight, she could tell that it was a nightmarish abomination that had been stitched together from multiple creatures. One thing you can say about the Reses, they don't lack an imagination. The judge knelt down beside the creature's master, a woman dressed in a dirty green ballroom gown. Its hem was torn, tattered, and dirty, and its sleeves were stained dark with dried blood around the wrists. Her head was partially missing, blown half apart by the bullet that took her life. It wasn't hers. Justice carefully stepped around the necromancer's body, her attention upon the makeshift laboratory behind her. They had tracked the woman to a factory basement in the industrial zone. At first, Justice had suspected that the necromancer was just using the basement as a temporary shelter. But when they arrived, they had found what could only be described as an undead assembly line. The strange thing, to her mind, was that the factory above them was still operational. The necromancer. Is she attractive? The judge looked down at the woman's exploded face. He turned his head one way, and then the other, trying to imagine what she might have looked like while still alive. I suppose so. Not a redhead, so I can't say that I'm all that interested. But someone else might find her so. Justice smirked as she lifted a beaker of some unidentifiable substance and used her other hand to waft the vapours toward her. Her nose wrinkled at the unmistakable scent of embalming fluid, and her smile disappeared in an instant. The foreman's complicit with her presence here, then. Possibly the owner. She gestured to the two death marshals who were reloading their pistols near the door. I want the male employees rounded up and held for questioning. Anyone who spends time on the factory floor. The judge stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees with gloved hands. Just the men? He asked, his voice questioning. She set the beaker down and sighed. All the employees, then, just in case. The death marshals gave her lazy salutes, secured the pine boxes strapped to their backs into place, and started off toward the stairs. Once they were out of earshot, the judge joined Justice at the laboratory. That guy Meire, you said it wasn't made here. It doesn't fit. She turned toward him and gestured to the room around them. She has easy access to machine parts. Papers attached to the wall, not using surgical tape but with glue, which means that she had limited access to medical supplies. The judge nodded in understanding. The papers are all medical diagrams, but they're hand-drawn, all human. He caught sight of something on the other side of the room, crossed over to it and patted the top of its case with his hand. Guess what we have here? Ethervox, she replied, knowing the answer. He flicked the power on, filling the room with a rambling monologue on the proper bolts to use when affixing steel to bone. He listened for a moment, rolled his eyes, and then turned the radio-like device back off. Looks like another of von Stuck's students. Not the Chimera, though. Lady Justice went back to the abomination's side and knelt down beside its bisected corpse. She ran her fingers over its decaying flesh until she found the stitches, then followed them for a few inches. Tight stitching, all flesh to flesh. None of the metal substructures or replacement limbs that von Stuck's people used to join pieces. Someone else, then? The judge returned to her side and towed the other half of the chimera with his boot. Seamus, maybe. She smiled at the familiar joke. It's not wearing a dress. Justice stood, head still turned down toward the creature as she sorted through her thoughts. The judge took the opportunity to reload his pistol. When she still hadn't said anything further, he took a guess at what she was thinking. Him again. It has to be. Lady Justice sighed and ran a hand through her hair. It had recently been cut and was only a few short inches of bright red instead of the long mane she normally preferred. It just doesn't make any sense. First he murders half the city's resurrectionists and seizes control of their undead. Now he's loaning them out to people. She might have found it wandering around, he suggested. We know that Squidge tends to attract all of the really messed up stuff. This one could have been doing the same thing. Maybe. Justice wasn't convinced, and that carried into her voice. After a moment, she shook her head. In any case, let's go speak with the workers. I don't think we're going to learn anything else down here. The judge nodded in agreement and followed her up the stairs, leaving the severed and mutilated corpses of the dead behind them. For now. You spend my time carelessly, like a beggar with coins. Yanlo's staff tapped against the cobblestones, the iron rings dangling from its end clanked together with each step. His robes were dark green with gold trim, adorned with sashes of blood-red cloth. His long hair was pulled back into a ponytail that swayed slowly in an unfelt breeze. My apologies, Elder One. In contrast to Yanlo's mystical appearance, Nicodem's was almost mundane. He was dressed as always in a formal suit with a duster pulled over the top of it, a concession toward the cool night. The moonlight gleamed off the steel of his prosthetic leg and was reflected in the round lenses of his glasses. It was my understanding that the Nipponese considered it rude to speak of business without first engaging in harmless small talk. The ancient sorcerer cast a sharp glance at Nicodem. That the three kingdoms are united in this time does not mean it was always so, nor that it will be. First, my time is wasted with idle chatter. Now, with ignorance. Nicodem resisted the urge to pinch the bridge of his nose in frustration. He hated dealing with the elderly. When he was a proper undertaker before his time in Malifaux, it had been the worst part of his job. Now here he was, forced into a position where he had to deal with not only a crotchety old man, but one who was arguably one of the few necromancers in the world as powerful as himself. Perhaps even stronger. It was improper for me to assume. I can only profess ignorance as to your customs. That was not strictly speaking true. Nicodem had learned quite a bit about the history and customs of the Japanese, or Nipponese as they preferred to be called. In his own mind, he considered himself to be something of an expert. More than anything, he wished that Kirai and Koku hadn't returned to Earth. Even though she was stubborn and prone to deep depression, she at least understood the proper value of polite conversation. He would have much preferred to be dealing with her right now. Perhaps we could proceed directly to the matter at hand, Elder One. He waited until Yanlo made a get-on-with-it gesture before continuing. It has recently come to my attention that a certain element of the Little Kingdom has interfered in my ambitions. Given your importance with the community and our shared interests in the necromantic arts, I thought that you might have some influence over this element. Yanlo stroked his beard in contemplation. You speak of the 10 Thunders. Using his staff, he motioned to a side street, and they turned toward it, taking them past tall buildings adorned with Chinese, Japanese, and Vietnamese letters. Red and yellow paper lanterns hung from ropes crisscrossing the street. All of the windows were closed and boarded, and like the last street, there wasn't another soul anywhere in sight. Nicodem ignored his growing sense of unease and turned down the street with the old sorcerer as bidden. Yes. He couldn't feel any corpses, animated or otherwise, in the area, but that didn't mean that he wasn't walking into an ambush. The necromancers of the Three Kingdoms favoured calling upon ghosts and spirits over corporeal undead, and he had no talent for sensing them. The leaders of that organization took up arms against my undead, and ruined a great deal of work. It would not be unexpected for me to turn my aggression toward them in revenge. It would be expected. Yanlo stopped walking, prompting Nicodem to do the same. The ancient sorcerer leaned forward onto his staff, his beady eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. It is expected. Yet you come to me without the enslaved corpses you press into service. Yanlo lifted his staff and pressed it against Nicodem's chest as the iron rings jingled in an unfelt breeze. Foolish, perhaps. Why should I not flay the soul from your body and end the threat you pose to my descendants? Nicodem's expression conveyed boredom, not fear. I have crossed the veil of death before, old man. There is nothing in that world of corpses that I fear. Yanlo stared at him for a long time. Perhaps not, he finally said, withdrawing his staff. In its sleep, the claws of the dragon sometimes twitch. The mouse that finds itself caught beneath these claws might believe that the dragon has cruelly decided to end its life, but the dragon did not even know it was there. It is without dispute, however, that the dragon's claws still led to the death of the mouse. The sorcerer's bushy eyebrows raised meaningfully. Nicodem's knuckles turned white as his fingers tightened around the head of his cane. The old man was being deliberately obtuse. If the attack upon my property was the result of a lone agent, give me his name. There is no reason for this enmity to spill out across the entire little kingdom. Yanlo chuckled and continued walking, this time at a quicker pace. Leave this place, Mr. Nicodem. You will find no answers here. Rather than let the old man escape, Nicodem hurried after him, ignoring the pain where his pneumatic leg met the flesh of his hip. No! I demand a name! He reached out to grab Yanlo, but his hand passed right through the sorcerer, as if he was no more substantial than the moonlight. Nicodem recoiled in surprise, and as he watched, the old man faded away with another chuckle. Nicodem stood in the empty street, staring at the place Yanlo once stood. The meeting had not gone as he had planned, though he had at least confirmed his suspicions that the 10 Thunders had been the ones to ruin his plans a year before. He regretted his outburst. It was unbefitting of someone such as himself. After a few more moments of quiet self-chastisement, Nicodem straightened his coat and continued down the street, intending to return to his dreary mansion in the quarantine zone to give the matter more thought. As he passed a small curio shop, he gave in to temptation and shattered the window with his cane, sending glass shards tumbling down into the street behind him. It didn't do anything to improve his mood. One entire wall of Lady Justice's office had been plastered with a large map of the city. The different districts of the city were denoted by raised lines, as were the outer walls and the boundaries of the river. There were pins of varying colours and shapes pushed into various places around the map, and many of them were connected by thin lengths of coloured string. When the jury entered the room, Justice was standing in front of the map, her arms crossed over her chest. Had it been anyone but Justice, the jury might have thought she was staring at it in thought. Does that help? The jury pulled a chair over from the side of the room, turned it around and slumped down onto it, her arms crossed over the back. Not really. With a sigh, Justice turned toward the other woman and gestured toward the map. One of the accountants put it up in an attempt to help out. It keeps things organised for everyone else, though. We all want to help, the jury reminded her in a somewhat chastising tone. The pins are sites of attacks or resurrectionist lairs. Both. She gestured toward the eastern portion of the map. The red ones are the sites of attacks. The greens are discovered resurrectionist lairs, and the blues are alchemistry shops and pharmacies that we suspect of selling embalming fluid. The jury rested her head on her arms as she looked at the map. It was all but covered in pins. If nothing else, you've managed to turn the city into a delightful little rainbow. How far back are these going? To the very beginning. She reached up and tapped 2 pins near the governor's mansion. One was red and the other was yellow. This is the first documented attack. 9 years ago, Governor General Kitchener and his entourage are attacked by an unknown necromancer. He kills everyone but the governor and animates their corpses, only to flee when the guild guard arrive in the nick of time, prompting the creation of the death marshals. The jury finished, her head nodding in memory. Slimy bastard. What's the yellow pin for? Lady Justice moved back and forth, touching one yellow pin and then another, mentally following the attacks through the years. Most of the necromancers we deal with are sloppy or still learning their craft. We only have a few exceptions. Von Stuck hides in the sewers and blasts those damnable seminars across the Ethervox. Seamus cleans out brothels almost as fast as the slumlords can set them up. The surgeon just releases undead out into the world without much care as to what sort of trouble they get into. The jury ticked off more names on her fingers. Then you've got Squidgepidge and her menagerie of weirdness, Kirai and her murder ghosts, and this new Reaper lady. Justice nodded. Exactly. All of the strongest resurrectionists have patterns that they follow. Every time they animate a corpse or bring a ghost through the veil, they might as well be pressing their fingerprints into wet clay. Except for Mr. Yellow. The jury was starting to perk up in interest. Except for Mr. Yellow. Justice agreed. Her fingers reached out and brushed across a yellow pin in the southern quarantine zone. He's been careful. For 8 years, he's avoided our attention and built up his power, probably squirreling bodies away wherever he could find them in preparation for last year's attack. It almost worked, too. She tapped a string of yellow pins in the eastern slums in rapid succession. I just haven't figured out how he managed to hide that many corpses right under our nose. We found a few of them in the hands of other necromancers, but... The jury's brow was furrowed in thought. What if that's exactly how he did it? Justice turned toward the other woman, her eyebrows raised beneath her blindfold. Things were starting to fall into place for the jury. She had always had a way of seeing the truth about things, and something Justice said had felt meaningful to her. What if he hid them right under our noses? Right under our feet? The 2 women were silent for a moment. Lady Justice held her hand out towards the jury, as if trying to slow her down, though her voice was hopeful. Are you guessing or are you doing your thing? The latter, I think. The jury hopped to her feet and started toward the door. I'll start pulling undertaker licenses. Justice was right behind her. Crematoriums, too. Have Hoffman send one of his watchers to find me when you have something. I'll be in the field. Nicodem's fingers drummed carefully against the head of his cane as he watched the death marshal poke around his funeral home. I can assure you, Mum, everything is in order. I pride myself on following the Guild's guidelines concerning corpse disposal to the very letter. No doubt about that, Mr. Nicodem. The death marshal was bundled up beneath a heavy duster and a wide-brimmed hat. But even from a dozen feet away, Nicodem could feel the necromantic energy infusing her body. She already had 1 foot in the grave, and he suspected that if she were to disrobe, his lips quivered in distaste at the thought, her body would be as emaciated and withered as a corpse. He watched as she opened the door to one of his crematorium furnaces and ran a gloved finger along the inside. You use these much? She asked. They seem pretty clean. If you do not clean them after each burning, the ashes from previous corpses end up mixed in with the current. He managed to mask his uncomfortableness at the question as slighted pride. I believe that the deceased and their beloved deserve better than that. The ploy worked, and he could sense the Death Marshal relax as she shut the furnace door. Seems like you run a pretty up-and-up business here. How many bodies would you say you typically dispose of in a year? He smiled, the same smile he used when trying to comfort his insipid clients. Oh, it's hard to say off the top of my head. Perhaps 2 to 3 a week. He made a vague gesture towards the door and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. As much as I hate to admit it, they tend to run together in my mind. I have been doing this for quite some time, after all. The Death Marshal nodded in understanding. 9 years, right? Nicodem was instantly on guard. The only way that the Death Marshal would know that would be if she had looked up his license prior to her arrival, and that meant that this wasn't one of the Guild's typical inspections. That sounds correct, he replied, his smile like carved wood. Here in Malifaux, at least. I also had a practice back on Earth. She nodded and moved toward the rows of caskets on display in the showroom. They ranged from the fancy to the mundane, but each of them was nicer than her own pine box, which was propped up near the door. The door that she was slowly making her way back towards. Where was that exactly? Massachusetts. He followed behind her, his prosthetic limb clomping loudly against the floor with each step. American, eh? She ran her fingers along the inner edge of a white coffin as she walked, growing ever closer to the pine box she had brought with her. Why'd you decide to leave? Thought you could make a killing here in Malifaux? He didn't laugh at the joke. The politics. As she reached toward another coffin, he stopped her hand with his cane. Please, mind the merchandise, ma'am. The Death Marshal looked back at him, and in that moment, Nicodem knew that she knew. Perhaps she was just enough of a corpse for his senses to pick up on and interpret her body language. Perhaps it was a premonition. Perhaps he was just being paranoid. Sorry, she said, withdrawing her hand. Just admiring the craftsman. Her words were cut off by the head of Nicodem's cane, which connected solidly with the side of her head. It shattered her jaw and sent her staggering into one of the display coffins, which tumbled to the ground in a loud crash. The Death Marshal's heavy Peacebringer pistol was in her hand in a moment. She was still off balance, however, and Nicodem was faster. His hand glowed with eldritch green light as he raised it, seizing her body's muscles and locking them tight in rigor mortis. Her finger tightened on the trigger and sent the bullet ricocheting off his steel leg. Nicodem winced at the impact. That's how I lost the first one, he mused, his hand still glowing with power. I never could figure out quite how to keep a corpse's reflexes intact after their lapse into death. It's frustrating to see you all prancing about, acting like normal people. You're no different from my own zombies. He reached forward and pushed her hat back, revealing a forehead plastered with flaking, dried skin. I suppose that Lady Justice is a better necromancer than I originally suspected. It's a pity that she's chosen to hunt her own kind, but then I suppose I'm not in a place to judge. The Death Marshal's arm quivered as she tried to raise her pistol and point it toward him. Nicodem politely stepped past her, made his way to the door and threw the bolt, locking them in. Then he turned to her pine box, pushed it down onto the floor, and kicked it across the floor so that it came to a rest behind her. His lips pulled back in a thin smile as he returned to her side. She tried to say something, but without the ability to move her mouth, it came out as a mumbled growl. Such language. Using his foot, he pushed open the lid of her pine box, revealing the swirling nether space contained within. Let's go find you a nice plot. The judge was squatting in the entryway, examining the faint footprints left in the dirt on the wooden floor. Someone was here, he said, motioning toward the door. I'm not seeing any blood, so it doesn't look like a fight broke out. But something was dropped over there. I'm guessing one of the coffins fell over." There were 2 death marshals in the showroom and the funeral home, and another 3 in the back combing through the embalming room and the crematory furnaces. Thus far, nobody had found anything suspicious, which was suspicious in and of itself. Most funeral homes cut corners where they could, even in small ways: cardboard caskets, cheap embalming fluid, artificial flowers. "Found a bullet hole," one of the death marshals called out. The judge went to investigate and knelt down beside the small hole, which was buried in the wall near a window, just below the sill. "Probably a ricochet," he murmured. "The angle's too weird for anything else." As he straightened up, the door opened, revealing a death marshal in a short top and a wide hat. She was one of the few who had avoided the corrupting influence of the necromantic magic they drew upon, though neither she, Lady Justice, or any of the others who had managed to remain fully intact had quite figured out why they were spared when others were not. "It's the commander, sir. She's asking for you." He started toward the door. "Did she find anything?" She shook her head. "No, sir. Not a damned thing." The funeral home was a small little building perched in the central slums. It had the sort of quiet, somber quality that he had always associated with churches, though the owner had clearly taken his business down a non-denominational route. The mortician's license claimed that it was owned by an Aloysius Nicodem, but the judge suspected it might be an alias. Behind the building was a large cemetery, ringed by a tall iron fence and lorded over by a sulking willow tree. Once it might have been a picturesque and peaceful sight. Now it was torn up and defiled. Lady Justice had taken the bulk of their death marshals out back when they arrived, and they had already managed to dig up 8 of the graves. "Empty," Lady Justice called out to him as she tossed her shovel to the ground. 8 graves picked at random, all of them empty." "Buried that way." The judge joined her at the edge of one of the opened graves. She shook her head. "No, these were dug up within the last year and then carefully replaced. He wasn't burying the dead. He was stockpiling an army." "I've got worse news." He hooked a thumb toward the funeral home. "We've got papers back there for graveyards all across the city, all registered to different names. I'm not sure how many of them he dug up for his assault last year. But if even a quarter of those graves are still filled with bodies, we're in a bad place. I'm guessing that most of the undertakers on the jury's list are going to end up being this guy." "Any sign of Hadley?" The judge shook his head. "Looks like there was a fight. But she must have been taken down pretty quickly. No blood, nothing more than a few scuff marks and a single bullet hole. Doubt she got off more than one shot before she went down." "That means we're on the right track at least." She looked up and ran a hand through her hair. "We'll have to send people to go investigate those other graveyards. Full combat patrols in case they encounter him while searching. Hopefully we can find something before we have to pull everyone back to guard those Spanish." "Civilian," the judge warned, cutting her off. A young woman had come around to the back of the building and was peeking curiously past the open gate. Despite her Asian features, she was dressed in a simple worker's shirt and pants, though her long hair was woven together into twin braids in a decidedly Eastern fashion. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, stepping toward her. "This is a restricted area. You'll have to move along." "Oh, my apologies." Flustered, she held up the bouquet of flowers in her hands and looked around the graveyard in surprise. "I was just bringing some flowers to my grandmother's grave. She just passed a few weeks ago." She took a cautious step forward. "You're not digging up graves, are you?" Lady Justice adopted a sympathetic look and motioned toward the grave at her feet. "I don't wish to alarm you, but some of the corpses appear to have gone missing. Do you know anything about the man who owns this place?" The woman gasped in horror. "Missing? You mean turned into zombies?" "We don't know that for sure," the judge said. "If you can remember anything about the owner, it would really help us out, though." The woman bit her lip as she tried to remember something. "He was tall, very compassionate. One of his legs was a prosthetic, I remember that. Oh!" She snapped her fingers. "That's right. I had some trouble finding a coffin that I liked. and he offered to take me to a warehouse in the riverfront slums to look at some other options. Her cheeks flushed with colour. It wouldn't have been appropriate for me to accompany him to such a place, though, so I ended up just choosing a cheaper coffin. The judge glanced back at Justice, who nodded. Well, he said, looking back to the woman, thank you for the information. Grab one of the marshals inside the funeral home and give them your information in case we have any more questions. Of course. The woman bowed, a strange gesture given her garb, and left to speak with the indicated marshals. The judge waited a few moments. Want me to post a watch? Lady Justice thought about it for a moment, and then shook her head. No, he'll be too careful for that. Let's talk to Lucius, and have him put one of his people on it. They're better at this sort of thing. Fine. The judge sighed. But I'm not going to ask him. She smirked and motioned for the death marshals to start filling in graves. What's the matter? Afraid? Despite his duster, the judge shivered. Of Matheson? Yeah, I am actually. Mortimer carefully patted the earth into place with the flat of his shovel. There you go. She's as good as rain, boss. Surprised you hung around. The afternoon had segued into evening. Nicodem had been going over his brief conversation with the death marshal as he waited, and it took him a moment to realize that his assistant had spoken directly to him. One can never be too cautious when it comes to death marshals. Should have just killed her and made her a zombie. Light flared as Mortimer lit a match and held it to his cigar, puffing on it a few times until the end glowed a dull orange. Would that I could. He stared down at the grave. They do something that prevents their bodies from being animated after death. Even Kirai found it impossible to shackle their spirits, though not for lack of trying. Mortimer gestured with his cigar. What about the bird with the hole in her chest? Tamaris? She's got a crew of dead marshals, don't she? Tara. Nicodem's lips pulled back in a scowl. It's not her. It's that brain-dead woman that she drags along with her. She's the idiot savant of necromancy. Mortimer shrugged and puffed on his cigar. Seemed nice enough to me. We had a good chat at the last Resurrectionist ball. He thought about that for a moment. Probably was the last Resurrectionist ball, wasn't it? I mean, you killed most of them. Sacrifices had to be made. He motioned for Mortimer to follow him as he rejoined the cobblestone path that would lead them out of the graveyard. Have you managed to procure the corpses I require for this affair at the Enclave? I did. He exhaled a cloud of smoke, and Nicodem paused as the wind blew it right into his face. Mortimer blanched and immediately scurried over to the downwind side of the taller necromancer. Sorry, boss, but yeah, I got them all ready and waiting. Where should I be taking them? Nicodem resumed his walk, his cane marking out a steady staccato on the cobblestones. No doubt Seamus will contact us before too long with the details. When he does... They both slowed to a stop as they noticed a woman waiting on the edge of the graveyard. Her deep purple kimono did a good job of helping her blend into the darkness, and her hair was pulled back into two twin braids. For a moment, Nicodem almost thought that Kirai had returned to them. But as they drew closer, he realized that the woman was unknown to him. Good evening, madam. Here to visit the dead? The woman smiled disturbingly and tucked her hands into her sleeves. I need not visit a graveyard to speak with my ancestors, Mr. Nicodem. Their advice guides my every action, and it is their word that has brought me to you. Mortimer started to circle around toward the woman, but Nicodem raised a hand to stop him. You speak of Yan Lo, he said, addressing her. She inclined her head. Yes, I am his niece, Katanaka Chiaki. Well, Mortimer said, stepping forward and extending a meaty hand in her direction. From the lackey of one necromancer to another, it's a pleasure to meet you. Name's Mortimer. That's Morty to my friends, which you certainly count as Kate. Chiaki stared down at his extended, sweaty hand, and then looked up, smiled politely, and bowed. All right. Eastern types." He winked at her, ran his hands down his dirt-stained shirt, and then returned her bow with an awkward one of his own. "Always enjoyed the customs of the Far East, though you do make a man's job difficult with all them cremations. Kind of creepy to be keeping shrines to the dead all over too. And I'm saying that as a reser, so you gotta—" Nicodem pinched the bridge of his nose. "Mortimer. Eh? Oh, right, time for business talks and all." He waggled his eyebrows at Chiaki, motioned between them with one finger, and nodded in silent confirmation as he backed away. "We'll chat it up later." Chiaki just stared at him confused, until Nicodem cleared his throat. "Yes." She stared at Mortimer for a moment longer, and then turned back to Nicodem. "My uncle has reconsidered his earlier position, and now wishes to help you resolve your enmity with the Ten Thunders before it can turn into further loss for either of us. I assume that this is an acceptable resolution for yourself as well?" Nicodem nodded. "That is why I approached him in the first place. I only wish to see those who ruined my plans punished for their presumption. Once that has happened, I have no further grudge against your organization." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Then revenge you shall have. There is a warehouse in the Riverside district that has been marked with the symbol of the crow. In 1 week's time, the woman responsible for the ruination of your plans will be there to stow a small curio. My uncle is of the belief that if something were to happen to her while she is at the warehouse, the Ten Thunders would be too preoccupied with other matters to investigate too closely." "I understand." He reached up and tipped his hat to her. "Please send my regards to your uncle. I knew that we could come to a mutually beneficial agreement." Chiaki's only response was another smile. When she returned to her small apartment, Chiaki found her uncle waiting for her. "All went as planned," she explained as she carefully seated herself at the low table in the room's center. "In 1 week, the ram and the crow will meet." Yan Lo was seated across from her. In the faint gloom of her apartment, he glowed like a dim candle. "As was foretold long ago. They have both seen the signs, which they have chosen to ignore. Only one will survive this conflict." Chiaki tilted her head in curiosity. "Which will it be, Uncle? The ram or the crow?" He lifted his fist, then opened it, splaying his hand wide as he waved it in front of him. "It is up to fate. One will perish, the other will weaken. Either way, the result is not our concern. Either way, we become stronger." She inclined her head in understanding. "Yes, Uncle." Looking back up to him, she motioned to her flute, which rested on a stand atop a small shelf. "Shall I play for you, Uncle?" Yan Lo's lips pulled back in an affectionate smile. "I would enjoy that, child. Play a song of death, a dirge for the fallen. Let your music guide them to the next life and wash away the sins of this world." Chiaki stood, retrieved her flute, and once again seated herself at the table. Her eyes met those of her ancient ancestor, and then she began to play a slow, haunting melody. It was a song of loss and pain, and of remembering the past, even as the future crumbled into ruin.
That's it for another episode of the Wyrd Chronicles. Join us next time for more tales of action and adventure.